Thank you for joining us on our podcast, Decoding the Black Box, What Physicians Miss on cybersex trafficking targets and what cybersex trafficking targets can bring up during their physician visit. Now, I'm coming to you almost 19 minutes past the hour. And by that time, several women would have been sexually assaulted under a normal sexual assault. With cybersex trafficking, the number of women who are sexually assaulted is greater. Now, the statistics shows that every 6 to 8 minutes, a woman is sexually assaulted. With the cybersex trafficking statistics, it is between 4 minutes. So this is very essential. Now, about me. I am a cybersex trafficking advocate as well as a stalking advocate. And I'm going to tell you why this is essential. That cybersex trafficking targets and the community at large needs to stand by cybersex trafficking survivors. And I have a slide here in front of me. I'm just going to read off key points. But I want you to understand that there are 2 components of cybersex trafficking. And I'm going to bring you up a 3rd component of cybersex trafficking that is normally at the aftermath of cybersex trafficking. Here's scenario 1. Scenario 1, a trafficker uses fear and intimidation to get women, girls, boys to engage in commercial sex acts on a screen where the buyer watches. That's the scenario 1, and that's just using fear and intimidation. Scenario 2, a target is tagged with a chip set up with a biosensor feedback where the buyer engages in sex in real time with a target. That's what we're going to hone in on this week. Scenario 2. Now, the 3rd scenario is usually at the hands after the act has been done and the act has been recorded on the screen, where a person images is trafficked online. Their sex act or their images is trafficked online. And you normally is placed either on a revenge porn site or Pornhub or some other similar type site, trying to humiliate a cybersex trafficking target. So why is this important and how does it intersect with stalking? Because normally the pimps and trafficker, in order to commit these sex acts, must know where the target is in real time to engage in sexual acts with the target. Because at one time, range and distance is essential. Because you're not having sex in the same space at the target. So you must have to overcome those shortcomings as far as distance and time. So knowing where a target is, the longitude and latitude of a target, GPS coordinates of the target, allows pimps, traffickers, intimate partners, Johns, allow them to perform sex acts on targets without consent, engage in sexual acts without being in the same space as targets, and targets are stalked first, and sometimes they're drugged and tagged with tech or coerced to put on some biosensor device underneath their skin or ingested. So we're going into an area that hasn't been covered all that much, except for here. And normally during South by Southwest week, we cover different topics under decoding the black box when it comes to technology, which is supposed to be helping mankind with sexual components. But now we see that what is done is just exploited women, girls, and boys. So we're talking about the same old remote brothel type experience. And this is what technology really has done. It's just lowered the price and threshold so that the average John can exploit women and girls and young boys from marginalized groups to be taken advantage of. And we saw the effects of this technology pretty much during the height of the pandemic, where there were lockdowns. And pretty much technology, remote sexual technology, kind of exploded during this time. Exploded in the UK and other areas, Japan and other areas. But we saw that there was research behind this technology ongoing since the as early as 1996, early 2000s, and saw its progression in the last 2 decades. And this is the reason why we're having this conversation, because it's been pretty much left out of the mainstream of doctors and physicians. People have an assumption that because it's remote sex, there's no sexually transmitted infections. That's not the case. And depending on the type of situation, a cybersex trafficking target can either be both remotely sexually assaulted or trafficked and sexually assaulted in real time in physical space at the same time. So you have that going on at the same time as well. So we're going to be focusing on what physicians should be looking for, because these survivors are going to show up at the doctor's office for routine exams. Despite the fact that, a 2-year hiatus, people are now slowly making their way back into the physician's office. And sometimes, these survivors don't have a choice because of the infections, particularly since their pimp or their John forces them to get themselves treated so that their physical Johns are not concerned with getting infected. So here's typically what we have a concern with physicians, nurses, gynecologists, one of the concerns that we have is that many physicians, gynecologists are not trained to spot normal human trafficking targets. And if they're not tracking or trained to spot normal human trafficking targets, then they will not spot cybersex trafficking targets. So this week, we're going to cover some of the conditions that cybersex trafficking targets present themselves to physicians. We're going to look at, in the next upcoming days, inflammation in the body, which can present itself with a myriad of conditions, whether it's joint pain, whether it's chronic inflammation, whether it's weight-related inflammation. We're going to be looking at STIs that present itself to the gynecologists and normal physicians on staff when they come to the emergency room. And when targets complain of excessive blood flow, those are some of the things that gynecologists would address, and some of the things that they miss, even with a normal probe. And we're going to be looking at how we can better protect cybersex trafficking survivors through use of our technology that's now so low cost and price that anyone can be a pimp and trafficker. So we want to look at our wireless hotspots, look at our technicians who can better protect survivors. And we have challenges so that we hone in into which of the technicians are better suited to protect our modern day cybersex trafficking survivors. And that's coming on later on this week. So the use of MRIs and X-rays can also help spot internal injuries related to trauma. I'm going to give you an example of that, but before I do, the basic miss in a physician's office is bruises. Even though the sexual act is remote, it does cause bruising. It causes bruising in the vaginal area. It causes bruising in the anus area. And it causes bruising along the throat, arms, legs. And the reason for that is because this is a biosensor that's pretty much interacting with the vagus nerves. And think about it. The vagus nerve controls mainly, pretty much, the whole entire organs, functionality of our symptoms, of our whole entire system. We're talking about how many times our eye blinks. We're talking about our palate. We're talking about the nerve sensations in our hands and our feet, and our taste buds, as well as our sex organs. So it covers a lot. So when a physician comes in and a woman from a marginalized group present themselves, and what they typically do is check for blood pressure, check their neck for thyroid conditions, and ask if there's anything wrong with the patient ailment. What they're not checking for is bruises. And if you're from a marginalized group, those bruises are not going to be detected in normal light, particularly if you are darker toned skin. So targets of cybersex trafficking do get bruises and suffer infections due to repeated sexual violence. STI infection in areas where there is repeated trauma related to sexual violence. Bruising do occur on outer layer of skin and internally. MRIs can catch hematomas. So let me give you an example of this. A cybersex trafficking target presented herself to the physician's office, who then referred her to the osteopedic doctor, right? Because of back pain, right? Back pain. So on first glance, the orthopedic doctor decided to put the cybersex trafficking target just to see what was going on, do a normal x-ray in the office, just to get an image of what was happening. And they noticed that there was a mass on the leg of the cybersex trafficking target. And so, because of that, the orthopedic doctor had prescribed to the cybersex trafficking target a de-inflammation medication, an inflammation medication that was supposed to reduce the inflammation that the orthopedic saw through his diagnostic tool. So this cybersex trafficking does produce other type of injuries other than what present itself through sexual violence. Because the John or the pimp or a trafficker is trying to induce other type of injuries as a method to control its target, its breadwinner. And sometimes they will injure the target, but not so much that it damages, but it's still a damage. It's still a damage, but as long as they're able to utilize other functions of the cybersex trafficking targets, they will yield and try to exert control through that biosensor that the target is carrying on them. That's just one example. Black and brown girls, boys, and women, bruising don't appear under natural light, but appear under purple and blue light. Something as simple as a blue and purple light can detect bruising. So, and there's something that the doctor can use in the office that they can use to detect any type of surface bruising. Because the nature of the sexual violence, strangulation is one of the top form of sexual violence exerted, not only towards cybersex trafficking targets, but also in dating violence and intimate partner violence. So bruising around the neck is often a phenomenon that is presented in marginalized groups. That trying to that choking sensation. And there is something that appears that people would probably assume that it is a hickey, but it's actually bruising caused by the cybersex trafficker and John. So, cybersex trafficking targets are always trying to appear as normal as possible. Will wear long sleeves or high collared shirts, so that they don't get questioned. But the physician office is the opportunity to detect all forms of sexual violence, all sorts of abuses, and give services to those who are in need. But it must be recognized. Another condition that is presented in the physician office but often missed, and people think that people don't take care of themselves, is their feet. And because the pimps and the traffickers are trying to keep a tight leash because of the range and how range of distance and how much they can exert in real time on their survivors, they will try and often will impede the movement of the cybersex trafficking targets, just so that they still remain in range for their type of intimidation and coercion. So that means they will cause blisters underneath the feet of a cybersex trafficking target. Just so that they do not venture too far. Because if it's painful to walk, painful to run, they still maintain control and power over the cybersex trafficking target. So sometimes what is presented into a podiatry office of thick skin underneath the soles of the feet is often the result of that of a cybersex trafficking pimp or trafficker. It's just wielding control over the survivors. If you can't move too far and you can't venture too far off their limited grid. Now, at one time, it was limited, but because of the Internet of Everything, and we'll get into that in the next coming days, and how they have enlarged their grid so that they can now control cybersex trafficking targets at greater distances, including out of state. And now, globally, this is a main concern. Here's another issue that's presented to the physician's office and why cybersex trafficking targets get overlooked. And that the price of exams would often deter a physician from doing more thorough works, more thorough examinations. So depending on the marginalized person's health plan, determines how much diagnostic tools is used to yield underlying conditions caused by a cybersex trafficking pimp or trafficker. So the cybersex trafficking target is at the whim of whatever factors are laid before them. And all they're asking is for a little attention so that they get the care that they need to heal themselves, but also get the care that they need to get themselves out of this cybersex trafficking condition. And so what it needs is a precisions by putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Let's put the pieces of the puzzle of the podiatrist's office visit. Let's put the pieces of the puzzle together when it comes to the gynecology visits. Let's put the pieces of the puzzle when the orthopedic comes in and present itself with inflammation that causes a limp on a individual, and ask, are you a cybersex trafficking survivor? Ask, are you in the trade? And let them say yes or no, because finally they're going to get the first time acknowledgement that someone knows what they're going through. They're going to get the first acknowledgement that when they present themselves into the doctor's office, someone is not thinking that they're crazy. And normally, when a cybersex trafficking target goes into the hospital to be treated, those treatments are real. They're getting care, but they're getting care for all the conditions that the cybersex trafficking pimp or trafficker or John had done to them. They're not getting to the root cause. That's right, the pimp and trafficker. So they're being presented with idiomatic end result conditions, but the root cause is the trafficking. The root cause is the technology behind the trafficking. And that's what the physicians fail to uncover. So, what can cybersex trafficking targets do? When should they go to the physician? In this one example, our cybersex trafficking target, after repeated sexual assault that went on for several months, our cybersex trafficking target started to see milky white discharge on her panty liner. And decided that it was not normal. It had a tinge smell. And so she presented herself to the physician's office, right? And because she didn't have a regular physician, she came in as a walk-in. And if you're not familiar with the walk-in situation, the walk-in situation means you're going to have to stay there into the worst medical conditions are seen first than the least conditions. So on why are you here on the note, you're going to, the target wrote, smelly discharge. That's not going to rank high on the list. So you're going to spend a long time, like at least 3 hours, depending on the hospital that you go to as an emergency room. 3 to 4 hours waiting until you get seen by a physician. Again, the reason for this is because of they don't have regular physicians assigned to them. And these are individuals from marginalized group. Now, this is why the Affordable Care Act was essential for cybersex trafficking targets. Because now everyone, if they do and do get into the Affordable Care Act system, those from marginalized groups, they at least get assigned a physician, and now they can actually make an appointment to discuss some of the idiomatic symptoms that the pimp or trafficker present themselves. But back to the emergency room visit of the cybersex trafficking survivor who came in because of a milky white discharge that had a tainted smell. She was in that emergency room, waiting room, for at least 3 hours. And this is one of these hospitals that's the main hospital for the whole, one of the main hospitals for the main regions, and known for very long hospital visits. But when the pimp trafficker knows that a cybersex trafficking survivor is at a hospital, this is like a play on the cybersex trafficking target. So while the cybersex trafficking target is there just for this one condition that they want to get checked out, what the pimp trafficker will exploit the location of the pimp, the location of the cybersex trafficking survivor, waiting in the waiting room for that entire 3 hours. This could include sex act on our cybersex trafficking target. This can be throbbing pain experience anywhere on the anatomy of the cybersex trafficking target. And actually disclosing where the cybersex trafficking target is in real time. All can it present itself, particularly if the cybersex trafficking pimp and trafficker is a social media whiz who want to exploit their cybersex targets online. So this is exactly what happened to a cybersex trafficking target. And this is another way to boost more buyers by disclosing where they are, and also to heighten what's happening to the cybersex trafficking targets by allowing regular Johns to get in. At the hospital of a waiting room. So you can imagine those who've done this, those who realize that the hospital waiting room is the last place they want to be in, but know that it's necessary to be in for their health. Because in the back of a cybersex trafficking mind, there's always a fear that, this can lead to a greater infection or a disease like cancer. So the physician finally came out and saw the cybersex trafficking target, took a swab of the cybersex trafficking target, discharge, and prescribe her with some antibiotic. Didn't ask any questions. Didn't ask any questions in regards to how many times a day are you sexually assaulted. Never came up. How many partners do you have? Never came up. How many virtual partners do you have? Never came up. How many times do you experience sexual trauma? Never came up. Here's your medication. You can get it filled at the pharmacy of your own choice. So the cybersex trafficking target got her medication, got her prescription filled, and that is the extent of what that physician first come in. And this is very important because cybersex trafficking targets are going to present themselves either through their gynecologist or through the emergency room as our initial cybersex trafficking target for an STI, a sexually transmitted infection. And how did this infection cause? The infection was caused by the repeated sexual trauma around the vaginal wall. And it doesn't have to always present itself on the vaginal wall. It can also present itself on the anus, particularly on the outside of the anus. And on the outside of the anus, you're going to see, or the cybersex trafficking target is going to experience hemorrhoids. Hemorrhoids is another condition that is also presented by cybersex trafficking targets as a repeated trauma to the anus area. The skin constricts, and you'll see either sensitivity during elimination. You see the walls of the anus gets very sensitive because of the tiny tears along the anus wall. The tiny sphincter wall, there's tiny tears. So infection can happen in that area as well, because now this normal smooth area that's covered in skin because of repeated trauma, now you have broken skin, and now you have waste coming in through that area, causing infection in that area. So the cybersex trafficking target is going to present themselves again at the physician office just for that. And that's what This is why this is very important, because these are the two main areas, because of the bruising, because of the infection, because of the constant reinfection. This discourse is so important, particularly for cybersex trafficking targets. There's two typicals. The anus and the vaginal area. Where you can ask questions. Are you in the trade? Were you ever in the trade? Did you ever not want to be in the trade? So questions like this, when survivors present themselves, are key to cracking it. Now, whether the trafficking survivor will answer these questions truthfully and honestly, this is where the physicians have to put the pieces to the puzzle together, because nowadays patients don't just come to you with one condition. There's a medical history that accompanies survivors. And that's why you don't need to be a real detective to understand that this individual is a cybersex trafficking survivor. This individual is a trafficking survivor. They present themselves with different idiomatic conditions, but all linked to trafficking, their sexual violence. So what is going to be prescribed to the cybersex trafficking survivor who present themselves in your office with hemorrhoids, but also a hemorrhoid cream, right? And what else? They're going to deal with the cracks around the sphincter. Perhaps another antibiotics. And this is why this is a huge issue. What happens when someone takes too much antibiotics? Right. They become too immune to other conditions so that the antibiotics are less effective every single time. This is why when COVID came around, it put cybersex trafficking targets at a disadvantage. Not only are they dealing with STIs, they're dealing with infections. And now COVID, those with healthier immune systems are able to fight off COVID. Those whose systems have already been compromised and have less immunity to fight off infections got swept away when the pandemic came around. This is why this symposium is important. We're talking about decoding the black box of AI cybersex trafficking and what physicians, doctors miss, nurses miss, gynecologists miss, and why this is important. We've lost too many cybersex trafficking survivors just through the pandemic alone because no one failed to recognize the conditions that they presented themselves to the doctor's office before the pandemic and after. So this is an opportunity not just to help AI cybersex trafficking targets, but also help regular human trafficking survivors and get them out, get them the help they need. And later on in this week, we're going to find out how technicians can help provide that assistance so they can break that chain between the trafficker and the technology used and that of the cybersex trafficking target. So let's look at some of the places that Johns and pimps love to have their excursions with our cybersex trafficking survivors. We know the hospital waiting room is an area, but there are other areas that our cybersex trafficking survivors, depending on this distance and range, they like to exert their power and control over our cybersex trafficking targets. So, Johns and pimps have engaged in sex with targets at places of worship? Yes. Faith-based organizations and churches, schools, gyms, ride shares. Cybersex trafficking targets are on call 24/7 on the whim of their traffickers, handlers, or John's desires. And this is pretty much obvious. Targets need to be free from the demands of their pimps, traffickers, and Johns through wireless tech. Now, I bring this to your attention for a key reason. When there is a gap in distance and in range, there is less control over the anatomy of a cybersex trafficking target. But if there's a wireless connection that the pimp and trafficker can exploit in a new location that a cybersex trafficking target is going into, they will exploit it. They will take advantage and sexually violate that target in that new place and that new location. So an example of this is our cybersex trafficking target, who would look for new physicians, new referrals to uncover what is happening, right? Because the desire of this cybersex trafficking target survivor is to get a physician, a credible physician, to acknowledge that this is happening, put the pieces to the puzzle together, and yet it has never happened. This is why this symposium has come to be, because it never happened for this particular cybersex trafficking target. That their conditions presented a case file that would go along with all the others. That didn't happen. We were too much of a desperate group for these physicians to put all the collective cybersex trafficking targets together to be identified in the physician's eye a select case. So while this initial cybersex trafficking target is looking for a physician to identify idiomatic conditions in a new place, in a new space, far away from their pimp or traffickers, that pimp and trafficker is going to try to stalk that cybersex trafficking target that whole entire time, trying to establish wireless locations to track and monitor. Sometimes they're able to overcome those barriers, other times not. But as soon as that cybersex trafficking target re-enters into the space, an established space, where that wireless technology is entrenched and is in force, the cybersex trafficking target is punished for venturing out too far. That can be bruises, burning sensation, all these sensations that is controlled by the vagus nerves. Nerves and tingling on hands, feet, all that. Neuropathy. So you might even see someone who comes to you in the doctor's office complaining of nerve tingling in the hands, feet, or leg. As a direct response to a pimp, trafficking, or trafficker. Just for leaving the established area where they were out of reach. So you can imagine if this is how they treat a cybersex trafficking survivor for going to the doctor's office just for treatment, just for a doctor to establish that they are a cybersex trafficking target, just so that the doctor will use the latest and greatest diagnostic tools to detect this biosensor that they have on them. What they would do to a cybersex trafficking survivor when they go to local law enforcement or the precinct. Or when they try to leave the area to seek employment outside in a new area and leave the whole entire state. So this actually happened to one of our cybersex trafficking survivor who was looking to leave the area, get a new job someplace else. And it just so happens through a staffing agency, our cybersex trafficking survivor was able to leave from one state to travel into another state and live with family and friends in that new state for a temporary job. Guess who was not happy about these conditions? Of course, the pimp and trafficker. But because they haven't established that wireless link, that secure network in that new area, there was nothing that they could pretty much do in that new area where the cybersex trafficking survivor were. So what was the next best thing they can do? Sabotage the job. Sabotage the job because they were able to monitor and surveil the cybersex trafficking target. They couldn't really much touch, even remotely, the cybersex trafficking target heavily because of the great distance but they were still able to influence the workplace of the cybersex trafficking target by disclosing internal memos, by eluding that there was a mole in the office, by alluding to information was being leaked. And who do you think is leaking that information? Yeah, they point the finger to our cybersex trafficking target. And at that time, we were just nearing, just around the credit crisis, when there was a credit crisis meltdown. So all jobs in that new area was going to fall anyway. Any contract work was going to fall anyway. But it was just a couple of months in the summer before the big impact of the credit crisis meltdown. The credit crisis meltdown came in the fall, and our cybersex trafficking target was summarily discharged without work in that summer of that 2008 year. And despite, because the cybersex trafficking target knew how important to maintain this distance from the pimp trafficker of the AI cybersex trafficking, tried in vain to look for a new position, pounded the pavement to no avail. In fact, what they did to our cybersex trafficking target, because their pimp and trafficker was internet savvy, was create a space where they would exploit the perils of the cybersex trafficking target, and exploit the fact that sending a disinformation to the public in regards to the family members of the cybersex trafficking target, wanting the cybersex trafficking target to be home. Quote unquote family members. What quote unquote family members want the cybersex trafficking target to be home other than those behind the AI cybersex trafficking? The Johns, the pimps, the traffickers, and their quote unquote collaborators. That's the family they were referring to on the various social media spots in regards to our cybersex trafficking targets. So it's not easy. It really is not easy. Despite what our cybersex trafficking targets does, and trying to escape the web of trafficking, and trying to put as much distance. The distance is getting less narrower by the day, because we're living in a 2024, the internet connectivity of everything. We'll get into that during this week, but just to see what our cybersex trafficking targets have to go through. It's amazing. Being a job troll, indicating that the family members on through social media influences wants her home, trying to prevent the cybersex trafficking target to get another job in a new area where, for the moment, protected from one's pimp and trafficker, derailed, and failure from doctors and physicians to acknowledge that this is, and she presented a a case of cybersex trafficking and failure from the meta community at that time to acknowledge this. So we have concluded day 1 of our podcast of decoding the black box of cybersex trafficking, what physicians miss. Physicians, nurses, and gynecologists. And what should cybersex trafficking targets present cases to present to physicians. And STIs is nothing to play around with. And even the pimp and trafficker will make sure that, particularly ones that are in the domain, will make sure that they get to a doctor. You know, particularly those that they can actually control, will make sure that they get to a doctor. Cybersex trafficking targets who present themselves sick remotely will eventually get to a doctor, but that's very important that they don't wait too long. Just because our initial cybersex trafficking survivor was so key in trying to make physicians pay attention to the idiomatic conditions she was presented, she made sure that every single time there was a new symptom, a new physical element, that she present herself in front of a physician. That doesn't mean that the physician was at all welcoming. For example, one physician was so upset because our cybersex trafficking survivor was in the low income range of things, right? So she present herself to the free clinic. And every single time she would make this physician do various tests to rule out certain conditions to present herself as a cybersex trafficking target. The physician just screamed out loud and said, "You have a file caseload of all these conditions that you present yourself," and was angry at the cybersex trafficking survivor for presenting every idiomatic conditions that the trafficker imposed on the body of her. And yet the physician was angry at her because of all the conditions, and the results, the end results, is that the test either wasn't conclusive or it shows that there was no underlying condition at all, right? But can you imagine, this is not an established case. The cybersex trafficking target is reaching out to you for help from the physician community, trying to establish that this individual is being trafficked, and they're being trafficked remotely, and they're presenting the case to you through their anatomy, because the anatomy is where they're being attacked. The anatomy is the battlefield. The anatomy is the battlefield, and the cybersex trafficking target is coming into you as an embattled patient. It's the embattlement. And the physician is waving up their hands, saying that you have too many scars, too many battle that is presented in their case files, and to what avail? That should never happen. No cybersex trafficking survivor or even human trafficking survivor should ever go through that, should ever experience that. So this is why this symposium was created, so that because you're not going to uncover it for the cybersex trafficking survivor. We have to allow you, the physicians, you, the nurses, you, the gynecologists, to be aware of the idiomatic symptoms that the survivors present, so that you get it, so that you're now educated, so that you now educate your colleagues, and so that you can, when you get new patients come in, ask the questions, use the right lighting in your office, whether it's a wand, or change the lighting in your office to a blue light so you can see what's going on when you look into the body and anatomy of a cybersex trafficking survivor. Thank you for joining us on day 1, and we'll see you on day 2 of decoding the black box of cybersex trafficking, what physicians miss, what symptoms that the cybersex trafficking survivors need to bring to the attention, and how technology plays a role. See you on day 2. Thank you.